Well, then, I am thrilled to introduce to you Lavie Tidhar. Lavie Tidhar grew up on Kibbutz Dalia in northern Israel and has lived as an adult in South Africa, England, Laos, and Vanuatu, which I hope I pronounced correctly. He currently lives in England and is a writer in residence at Richmond University. Lavie Tidhar has written in and across many genres, including science fiction, historical fiction, mystery, thriller, and literary fiction, publishing in formats including poetry, short stories, graphic novels, and full-length novels. He publishes in both Hebrew and English, and has written for children and adults. He's also written for the Washington Post as a regular book columnist, and wrote a monthly column for the Vanuatu Daily Post. His byline has also appeared in The Independent, The Guardian, Nature, New Scientist, SFX, and IO9, among others. Mr. Tidhar also edits the Apex Book of World Science Fiction, the Best of World Science Fiction, and has contributed to a number of speculative fiction anthologies. His work for children includes The Candy Mafia, a middle grade novel, the picture book, The Children's Book of the Future, which he co-wrote with Richard Watson, and the comics miniseries Adler. Mr. Tidhar's best-known work of speculative fiction may be Central Station, which also connects to a number of his short stories. Others include Neom, set in his Central Station universe, Unholy Land, and the recent The Circumference of the World. Other recent non-science fiction works include Maror and Adama, both labeled literary fiction, and Six Lives, which Goodreads classified as historical fiction. As for Mr. Tidhar's awards, his book Osama won the World Fantasy Award in 2012, and A Man Lies Dreaming won the Jerwood Fiction Uncovered Prize for Best British Fiction in 2015. Central Station won the Campbell Award, Neocom Prize, and Chinese Nebula Awards in 2017, and Unholy Land won the Pre-Planet Science Fiction Award in 2021. If I mentioned the awards and prizes that he's been nominated for, he wouldn't have much time to talk. So on that note, I would like to turn it over to Lavie Tidhar himself.
All right, well, thanks for having me. And I should mention I'm joining you from France, where I'm in the middle of a science fiction festival right now. So if I seem a little bit tired, it's day 3 of talking about this stuff nonstop. Um, Thank you for that lovely introduction. What I'll try and do, because I don't know how much people know my work necessarily, so I'll just talk a little bit about where I come from and what I do and how I got to this process, which hopefully touches a bit on Israeli science fiction as well in general. So as mentioned, I grew up on a, so I'm just going to move that in there. I grew up on a kibbutz in Israel, which is essentially a sort of a socialist utopian commune, which is an odd place to grow up. I have to admit, I have to admit, and also has that weird science fictional idea behind it, that it's about making a better society. And that's the way my grandparents sort of, came, that they wanted to create a better world than the one they lived in, and we're really quite unconventional about it. So it's a very strange environment, and that's part of the influence for me. That very early on, I grew up looking for the books that had that element of the strange in the children's library to begin with, which were, either Hebrew books or books translated mostly from Europe. And always looking for the slightly strange stuff, and then graduating to the adult library where we had all these American science fiction books in translation. And I always like to describe it that there was a little corner in the library that was made of one shelf of science fiction and one shelf of crime fiction, and I sort of hid in between them. And I always thought that I was just taking in all the science fiction, but it turned out the crime stuff sort of filtered through as well. And a lot of the work I do kind of incorporates elements of crime fiction into them. And when I think about it, I think my work really deals with history in some form. And it's either straight historical fiction like Maror and Adama, which deal with the underbelly of Israel, which is based on archival research and is about every single element of it is true, is based on historical research. Or I write histories of the future, which is a way of writing science fiction that looks at the far future as if it's already part of the past, that it's already historical, that it's already fallen into myth. And that's a technique I quite like using. And then my sequence of books that are essentially alternate histories, which look at sort of put a weird concave funhouse mirror to history in order to talk about real history and real historical processes. So part of the way I got into it is I moved to South Africa when I was a teenager, when I was about 16. At the very end, at the last, or I think it was the year when after apartheid ended. So really the transition from apartheid to a free South Africa, which is also quite a formative experience. And then ended up in England around 1998, and then ended up living in various places like Vanuatu in the South Pacific and Laos, and actually back in Israel for a little while before going back to England. And that stay in Israel around 2010, 2011 really helped me formulate some of the stuff that I'm still dealing with now in terms of fiction. And so, as you mentioned, the work I do covers a lot. The book that really started me on this path is a book called Osama, which is a sort of alternate history, but might not be. And it kind of deals with the war on terror, and it deals with the idea of Osama bin Laden through a concave mirror of alternate histories, which I wrote while I was living in Laos. And I partly wrote it because it seemed like fate, because me and my now wife kept coming very close to these attacks in London, in Egypt, we were actually in Nairobi in 1998 during the American embassy bombings, where no one had heard of Osama bin Laden, and actually stayed in the same hotel as the bombers, which was quite interesting. And so I thought, over the years, I thought this is a story that I really need to tell because it feels very personal. It comes close. But the tools that I want to use are the tools of speculative fiction and detective fiction. And so when I was growing up, my first language was Hebrew, and the stuff I was reading was translated. There was no Israeli science fiction. And I became very interested in what there was of Israeli science fiction, which were a few books here and there written by these strange guys. They were mostly guys. And there would be a book here, a book there. And and I had this very formative conversation that I was going to write my high school dissertation on Israeli science fiction. And I wrote to a bunch of people who were involved with a science fiction magazine back in the 80s in the hope that one of them might agree to kind of guide me through it. And I got a phone call from the guy who was the main translator and editor of science fiction at the time in Israel. And he actually phoned me up. And he said, the first thing you need to do is change the topic of your dissertation. There's no such thing as Israeli science fiction. And I ended up having to change, and I had to write about computers in science fiction, I think. But it always kind of stuck with me because I thought, firstly, there is Israeli science fiction in some form, and a lot of it was actually in children's fiction. But I also thought if there isn't any, then someone should do it. And eventually that someone became me by default. The other thing that affected my trajectory was that I started off writing Hebrew poetry, of all things. And at some point, I realized that I needed to move to fiction, that was really the thing that I wanted to pursue. And the question then became, and it was almost an existential question, is which language do I choose? And the right thing perhaps would have been to write in my birth tongue. But I was, young and ambitious and maybe naive. And I thought if I write in Hebrew, I will only ever be a small fish in a small pond. If I write in English, I can compete on a much larger pool, much larger scale. And I might end up being a small fish in a large pond, which seemed preferable. So that was kind of my reasoning for writing in English to begin with. What I didn't expect is for it to really take off. That's what caught me by surprise. And so I began by writing short stories, which are still my main passion, the thing that I like doing the most, and submitting them to magazines and getting them rejected. And I was very excited about the idea of getting rejected for writing because that meant someone actually read it and considered it. But as I realize now, I was also part of this new wave of science fiction, global science fiction writers, people who came from France, from Mexico, from India, who were using the internet for the first time as a way of breaking through to what up to then had been completely Anglo-American dominated, Anglophone science fiction world. And that was actually a very difficult and frustrating process because they couldn't really understand what you were writing. They couldn't really understand why they needed it. And the barriers to publication were much harder because you had to post manuscripts to America with stamped envelopes, all the rest of it. And that really stopped a lot of people from being able to submit. And what happened was that the online magazines of the time that were receiving no respectability whatsoever were more experimental, were more open to new voices. And so not just me, but a bunch of us started getting published in those magazines and eventually moving on into novels. And eventually the field became more accepting and broader. And that's a process that's only really been going on for the past 10, 15 years and is still very slow to change. And so, I began to write, I began to send the stories out, I began to be published. And one of the things that I realized, which was sort of my third realization in this process, is that I can't compete with American science fiction writers because I can't write about America. I simply don't have the knowledge of it beyond, what you see from films and TV, the sort of, you know, I call it the sort of Creative Commons USA. It's not the real America, just what you see on TV. But what I realized is what I had going for me, what was unique to me, is my background, where I come from, what I've seen. And so I never set out to imitate American writers. I set out to write things that I could relate to, that I could describe honestly. And that's been both good. I think it's been both good and bad. I think it's been good that it got me noticed and it's different to what everyone else is doing. It's bad because it's not necessarily what everyone wants. Um, and I think partly that's why I'm so drawn to trying different things and different modes and different forms of genre. The first book I did, as I said, was called Osama, and that only no one wanted to publish a book called Osama, so that that went through quite a journey. It finally found a very small publisher in the UK who put it out. And I kind of assumed that was the end of that. And it ended up winning the World Fantasy Award in the same year that Stephen King and George R. R. Martin were nominated, which made it seem a lot more exciting, I suppose, than if I had been up against, people who weren't them. So that was a very unexpected surprise and a very nice reception for this book eventually. And it got me my first sort of big book deal, which was for two books. And what I was writing at that time, I was writing books that were sort of political alternate histories. So I was looking at history changed, transformed, but with a political lens. I wasn't interested in the idea of making a change in history and then exploring what that means as a sort of scientific experiment in a lab. I don't really believe in alternate histories. There are histories that never happened, so what is the point? But the point was if I can use them to talk about real history, then that makes it interesting. And so I followed a summer with a book called The Violent Century, which kind of took the idea of superheroes, which is something I don't really care for. I'm not interested in superheroes a great deal. And I thought that would therefore make it interesting to give it a very literary sort of strange treatment. And I told the history of the 20th century through these people, these characters who don't age. And because there are superheroes on all sides of the conflict, nothing in history actually changes. So it's not even an alternate history, it's sort of a parallel history because it stays pretty much the same way. And it deals mostly with World War II, but moves through time as well to 2001. And so I began to realize that I'm writing histories of the 20th century, essentially. I'm trying to look at what made the 20th century the way it was? What were the processes that formed it? Because both the 18th and 19th century are so fascinating in the way they shaped the world we live in today. And so I went and wrote a third book after that called A Man Lies Dreaming, which is probably possibly one of the best things I've done, but also a very difficult book to pitch to anyone. And the short form pitch for it was I'm going to write about Adolf Hitler, Private Eye, which made a lot of people laugh and not a lot of people necessarily pick it up. And it's a book that I would be mortally offended if anyone had tried to write it. But I thought if anyone might get away with it, it's me. My mum was born in a displaced people camp in Germany after the war. My grandparents have been through Auschwitz, and I thought maybe I can get away with doing that, even though I would resent anyone else who ever tried to do this. And so I wrote this book because I didn't really have a choice, because I came back from being away. I came back to England in 2000, end of 2011, and I noticed I missed out the financial crash. I missed out a lot of stuff that was going on. And when I came back to England, I could feel the change in the air. I could feel the xenophobia rising. I could feel nationalism. I could feel those winds of fascism rising in Europe, in the UK, evidently in the US. And I thought, well, I need to write about this. And the best way I know to write about this is to write about an Adolf Hitler who never came to power, who is now a loser private detective living in London. And his story is really, it's a way of both exploring Adolf Hitler as a human rather than as a monster, because monsters are boring to write about. People are not monsters, they're people. So I wanted to understand what makes Hitler work. And so it meant a lot of research into his childhood, his parents, his relationships, just about everything. So I was living inside Adolf Hitler's brain, which is a very unpleasant place to be for a long time. And so I wrote this book not really expecting anyone to publish it. But I thought that, I think because it was the second book in a contract, they kind of just went away with it. And it got published, and again, it got noticed to a large extent, which was very nice. And so at that point, I'd done three books that were these, what I came to call as my political alternate history noir books. And I thought, I didn't really know where to go from here. I didn't know what to do. I was dealing a lot with things like Jewish identity. I was dealing with the 20th century. I was dealing with fascism. Not really stuff that flies off the shelf, to be fair, but also I wasn't sure how I could follow A Man Lies Dreaming with anything. And I wasn't sure that I should be doing the same thing over and over and over. And so but I felt like I had something more to say in that sort of genre. And so I ended up writing Unholy Land, which is a book that, again, all these books take a very, very long time to come to completion. I think each book takes on average 10 years from having the basic idea to getting the experience and the research and finally the writing part itself. And so Unholy Land was sort of my way of dealing with Israel and Palestine, which I haven't done before. And it was a way of also putting an end to my alternate history um, books. And so it doubles down. I think it goes all in on that stuff. It's saying this is the last book I'm doing, so I'm going to go all in on it. So we don't get just one alternate history, we get multiple alternate histories. We get three unreliable narrators who are sort of talking over each other. So you're not entirely sure who is speaking and what reality they're coming from. And it was a very carefully written book, I think. I think it's my most carefully written book. It's very specific. And it is essentially, or it starts as a story about a private, or, a writer of mediocre crime fiction, really, who sort of time slips from what seems to be our world into a world where there is a Jewish state established in Kenya at the turn of the 20th century. And that's where he's originally from. And he begins to forget the other world he was living in, and he gets involved in a pretty ridiculous investigation for his missing niece while getting entangled with other people who came from other realities where Jewish homelands have formed in a different way. And it kind of, and I got to talk about this today a little bit on the panel I was doing, which was about peace and the possibility of peace. And the book, I think, really grapples with that question. It grapples with the question of, can there be a peaceful Jewish state? Tries to deal with the questions of occupation and land, which is, again, land is another topic that I keep coming back to. What does it mean? Why do people fight over it? And so Unholy Land, I think, might be slightly bleak because it doesn't seem to come up with any happy answer. Because again, it's not really dealing with fictional realities, it's dealing with the realities that we live in. But after I've done this, again, I had the issue that I can't write these books anymore. I can't write these alternate histories. I can't repeat myself over and over, and I don't have anything left to say in that form. And it's again the struggle of, well, what form works for me? What can I do next? And so I grappled my way through it into a book called The Escapement, which is actually one of my favorite books, which has nothing to do with any of this stuff in a way. And yet it shares commonalities with them. I think as a writer, you can't really escape the tools and the motifs that kind of permeate your brain. But for me, it was a bit of an escape, and it's a book about a secondary world populated by clowns. And it's sort of like a Western, a fantasy Western, or rather a surrealist Western. And written in a series of episodes, essentially, rather than being a continuous novel. And so that was quite a nice change because it allowed me to understand I can do different things and in a different way. And it kind of led the way to what I would be doing from that point on. I started writing very different books. But I realized just now that I've completely forgotten to mention Central Station, which is remarkably possibly my most successful book, which I'll never understand necessarily. And that came very specifically from the time that I lived back in Israel. I lived in Jaffa in 2010 and 2011. And I've never lived in Israel as an adult. So that was quite an experience for me to suddenly come back, suddenly slip back into the language, and yet live in Jaffa, which is predominantly Arab, and be a stranger in this country that I didn't really know, and kind of look at it in a way that I've never been able to look at it before. And I became fascinated by the area of the Tel Aviv Central Bus Station, which recurs in several of my works now. And it's a place that is sort of composed of these old European Bauhaus buildings that were built in the 30s and have more or less fallen to ruin. And has been populated over the years by the immigrants that Israel has received. It's by, just checking something here. See if I can go back. Sorry. I did something wrong, my apologies. And I'm not quite sure how to close it.
If you need assistance, let me know.
I'm using a Mac, which I've never actually used. Yeah, okay, I think I'm back. All right. I became fascinated by the central bus station area. So the area itself is populated by a lot of Asian migrant workers on the one hand, and by a lot of African refugees on the other, who cross over in terrible conditions to try and reach, a better place from the wars. And I was fascinated by it. And I thought it was so vibrant, it was so alive, it was so different to what you think of Israel in any form. And at the same time, it's built around this enormous edifice of a bus station that has its own nuclear fallout shelter, and is enormous and horrible and dark, and everyone goes through it. And I became fascinated by it. And I'd walk around there, I'd see the place, and I thought what would be really interesting and what something that no one has done is to try and write a book that looks into the far future at the descendants of the people around the central station, and to write it as a science fiction story and therefore turn the bus station into a space station, essentially, the gateway to orbit, to the stars. Now, my other thinking about it was that I wanted to write something that was the opposite of an American science fiction book. And American science fiction, the stuff I loved and I read, and this book references numerous classic American science fiction stories. But the thing I wanted to do was American science fiction always focuses on action and excitement and adventure and high stakes and saving the world. And it always focuses on a single hero. And what it occurred to me is, firstly, I didn't want to write any action. I wanted to write about ordinary people, the descendants of those people, and how they lived their life. And because I love science fiction, what I wanted to do was to take all the cool stuff from science fiction, the spaceships and the robots and everything else, and put it in the background of the stories, and then forget about it and just write about ordinary people where the biggest thing is, the weddings, the birthdays, the funerals. Because what I wanted to do was, instead of writing about a lone hero, I wanted to write about the extended family, which is my experience, that you have a huge, messy extended family. And you can't go and save the world because you have to attend your second cousin's daughter's, birthday, and your aunt's not going to talk to you unless you go, and therefore you can't go save the world. And I thought that is a ridiculous idea. I thought no one is going to publish a science fiction book where nothing happens. And I often like to joke that this is probably the best science fiction novel set in Tel Aviv. Because, of course, it's also the worst science fiction novel set in Tel Aviv, because there are no science fiction novels set in Tel Aviv. And so I thought that would be interesting to do, but how do I do this? And I looked back at the American science fiction that I liked, and a lot of it was written as a mosaic. It was written in sections that could be stand alone on their own and published as short stories, but if you put them together, they added to more than the sum of their parts. And I thought that would be a nice way to do it, because it's polyphonic, it's it's nice, but also it would allow me the time to do it in my spare time. And even if no one wants to publish the book, I can publish the stories individually in magazines. And so I started writing this, and I wrote this for about 5 or 6 years, I think, while writing my so-called proper novels. And what I found is, firstly, the response to the short stories themselves was very positive. That the stories that I was writing about Central Station were always getting picked up for, year's best anthologies. They were getting picked up for translation. They were getting a lot more attention than other stories that I would have been writing. But I still had no faith in it as a book. And so I didn't know what to do with it when I finally finished it, which was about 2015, I guess, around the same time as A Man Lies Dreaming. I had no idea what to do with it. I didn't think anyone would publish it. It was short. It was weird. Nothing happened in it. It was set in Israel, where no one has really set a science fiction novel before. And I thought, well, what do I do? And I was very lucky that a small publisher in the States, Tachyon, actually saw something in it maybe that I didn't, or had more faith than I did, and said, we'll publish it. And also gave me the right notes I needed about putting the stories together into that coherent whole, which is different again from having them individually. And it's about putting them in the right way and the right shape so it all makes sense. And so this is the one book I wrote that I had no expectations of whatsoever. I generally was just happy that it came out in some form, and I was happy with that. And instead, for whatever reason, that is the one book that kept getting attention and actual sales, kept getting awards, and kept being picked up for translation. As I said, I'm in France right now. My latest book in France is Central Station, a book that was originally published in 2016. And so that book really tries to do the opposite of what Unholy Land does. So if Unholy Land looks at the present in a way and says there is no hope, there is no, there is no solution, there is, it's almost fatalistic. I said, no, I want to write an optimistic book. And partly, I don't know if I wanted to write an optimistic book, but if I wrote, I wouldn't be able to use all the cool tools of science fiction if the world wasn't going to be around in a few hundred years' time, you know. And so it had to work out magically that people stopped fighting and there was peace and there was prosperity. Otherwise, my characters couldn't move around. And I think I came up with the idea that there was a digitally federated sort of intertwined nation, which at that point no one even remembers who belongs to who. But you cross the street and you might be in the Arab part, or you might be in the Jewish part, or you might be in another part, and it's like a quilt, which is sort of the way the book itself is. And one of the weird things was that a few months after the book came out, I think I saw someone seriously suggesting that idea as a possible solution to have a digitally federated one state, which I wish I kept. I kept the clipping of that because it sounds too much like science fiction. So what that book wanted to do or had to be is optimistic, and it had to be long term. And I think the problem is when you're looking in the short term, everything is always bad. But if you're looking at the long span, things can't stay bad forever. Something has to change. And that's kind of where science fiction comes in, because it doesn't identify the change point, but it can imagine it. And I think that's valuable to write a book that offers hope, that offers a better future. And the characters in the books they're not rich, they're not powerful, they're just little people living their lives in this world, but they do live in a peaceful world. And I think maybe that was part of what resonated with people about the book. So it's a clear case of you can never predict what people are going to respond to, or not necessarily even what you're trying to say, because I wasn't sure what I was doing. I work very instinctively. But that idea of optimism in science fiction or writing about the future in an optimistic way really resonated with me after it came out, when I realized how much people craved that vision of hope. You know, how much of the fiction we consume is negative and dystopic, and the world is going, from bad to worse. And so one of the reasons I wrote my new children's book, the children's book of the future, was to do exactly that, to say to children, if you can imagine it better, you can make it better, or at least you can try, because we've messed it up, but you might be able to do it better. And it's not too late, and there's always hope. And I thought that was a really interesting project to do. And, you can never tell who's going to find it, who's going to read it somewhere. And I think, like a lot of writers, I don't write for reviews or for awards. I write for that kid in the library somewhere, in some small town, in the kibbutz, anywhere, who might pick this up one day and ideally be moved by it in some way. And that's certainly been my experience, that I've found books on the shelf that have changed me, and I've never been able to tell the authors, and I'm not sure the authors would have appreciated hearing about it necessarily, which I think a lot of us are quite uncomfortable with any sort of show of affection. It's, we're not the most sociable people at the best of times, writers. So that was sort of almost like the early phase of my work, that transition period, which would have been 2017, when I'm trying really hard to figure out what I'm doing, what I'm writing, what do I have to say, what can be better than what I've just done, which is a very difficult thing to do. And sort of moved into having a bit more fun with it as well, I think. And I wrote a couple of books that kind of deal with British fantasy myths. I wrote a book about King Arthur called By Force Alone, and a book about Robin Hood called The Hood, which both of them sort of deconstruct British myth and really what makes British nationalism, And they are similar to the way A Man Lies Dreaming deals with the same questions. A Man Lies Dreaming pretty much predicts, or it doesn't predict, but it says if this goes on, you end up with Brexit and Trump. And so reading A Man Lies Dreaming in 2014 was very, very different to reading it in 2016. And I think the speech I wrote for Oswald Mosley in my book, who was the head of British fascism at the time, and I gave him a nice victory speech because he gets elected. And I think that was pretty much word for word what Nigel Farage delivered when the Brexit results were announced. And at that point, I said, this was supposed to be fiction. This was supposed to be and if this goes on, you don't actually expect it to then go on. But I had a lot of fun kind of taking these tools and deconstructing the myth of King Arthur and Robin Hood and really looking at British nationalism and what supposedly makes a British identity and having a lot more fun with it, and again using these fantasy tropes and so on. And the thing that really then changed what I'm doing again is that I had very supportive publishers in the UK who basically said they wanted to publish me rather than publish my science fiction or whatever else. And they said, you should write the book that you want to write, not the book that you think we want, which I've never heard anyone in publishing say, and they don't say it, basically. And so I said, the book I really wanted to write, and I've had again in my head for a very long time, was a book about the underbelly of Israeli society, the secret history of Israel, the stuff that I've sort of been interested in for a very long time, which is, the way the underworld is prevalent, the hidden assumptions about Israel, the myth of Israel. What does it mean? And how do I look at it through these horrible characters and these horrible actions that have taken place? And the things that people don't want to look at, the crime and how the crime ties in with the politics and all the rest of it. And I wasn't even sure that I could do it because it was so different to anything I've done before. How do you write a book without the elves, without the aliens, whatever? And it turns out that all you do is you don't put elves and aliens in. And so I wrote a book called Maror, which is a huge book. It's 150,000 words, not available in the US, sadly, at the moment. And that book goes over 4 decades of Israeli history from the 1970s to more or less the present. And looking and it's a mosaic again. It sort of makes up the story with a lot of different stories that travel through time and look at a wide cast of characters. And really looking at the hidden underbelly, all based on historical research. And it's a lot of it was everything about it was new to me. I was basically being a detective myself. I was piecing together this secret history from newspaper archives and without having any clear idea of where the story was taking me, but trusting that history would lead me through it. And I only had 3 points of reference, which was a car bomb attack in 2003 or 2004, which was a real car bomb attack against a mafia figure that killed 3 bystanders, and a possible serial killer investigation in the 1970s, 1980s, around where I grew up, along the coastal highway leading to Haifa. And the third one was a music festival in 1994 that was a few months before Rabin was assassinated. And that sort of dream or illusion or the hope of peace vanished with him. And so this music festival disaster for me became the indicator for what's to come. And so between these 3 points, I had to investigate my own history, my own assumptions, and really delve deep. And I was really happy that I was able to do that. And again, I felt that I did something that hasn't been done for Israel, which is taking this almost James Elroy approach to history and uncovering the dirt and discovering where the bodies are buried. And the idea was then to do a trilogy that goes back in time and keeps picking at these wounds in a way. And so the second book, Adama, focuses on a kibbutz, which is where I grew up. And so it's a place I know, and it's a place I'm one of the only people who can write about. And I wanted to trace the history of a kibbutz family over 4 generations. I wanted to go back to the 1930s, really 1940s, and then work my way to the present again, and looking at things that I never really considered, like, the way my mum was born in a displaced persons camp. I didn't know anything about it, and researching that was fascinating, and really trying to understand my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation. And in this one, I was leaning a bit more now, less into crime. Maybe I leaned into the gothic a little bit. I still went with, it's still crime, it's still gothic, but it's really focused on this single family. And so I've just recently delivered the third book, Golgotha, which then goes back to the Ottoman Empire and then to the last week of British Mandate Palestine. And that's sort of, to me, the perfect way to end this, by going back in time and looking at the forces, the the great European powers that really shaped the world that we live in now, and very casually, very casually. And the way the whole Middle East was formed, the modern Middle East, is with people drawing lines on a map in a hotel room in Cairo at some point, and making backroom deals and saying, we need this guy, so we'll give his sons kingdoms. And so much of the world and the instability of the world we live in now, we can trace back to these colonial powers that go back to the 1920s or so. And so that was very interesting to trace. But whether I'm writing science fiction or historical fiction, my main job isn't really to give answers. I can't give glib answers to difficult questions, but my job is to ask the questions and to try and show the complexity and the messiness and the human element behind everything that we see, or at least that's what I try to do, while also having the difficult job of trying to make it entertaining enough that people want to read it. So you have to excuse me. Yeah, I think it all works all right, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Keep getting messages on there. So that kind of brings me to where I am now. So I followed up in terms of Middle Eastern science fiction, which, is not something I can speak about with any great authority. I do edit these anthologies of international speculative fiction, and so I keep a very close eye on writers when they become available. And I've certainly published a few writers from Egypt, from Palestine, from several places in the Middle East, and I try to keep up. But in terms of my writing, the places that I'm familiar would sort of be Egypt, would sort of be Israel, would sort of be. Um, I became fascinated by the Arabian Peninsula. And so at one point, I discovered this idea that at the time was just a 30-second marketing video on YouTube of a city called Neom, which was going to be a futuristic sci-fi city on the Red Sea, basically just opposite Egypt, in Saudi Arabia. And I thought, well, that's fun. That's a strange little thing that no one's ever going to do, but it's ripe for science fiction. And so I thought, what if I wrote a book or a story to begin with, set in the city when it's already old, when it's already in the past, when it's been shiny and new, and now what happens now, And I started writing. I wrote the story. I had some elements from the Sinai, which is a place I've been visiting on and off for quite a long time. And there were some elements from the Sinai I really wanted to put in. And so I had this one story coming in from the Sinai and one story coming in into this non-existent city called Neom. And I ended up writing a book during the pandemic, almost as an escape, that was entirely set in Neom in the far future, in what would have been an independent part of Saudi Arabia. And one of the surprising things again with that is that they actually did go ahead and say we're going to build Neom. And I actually know a Spanish speculative fiction writer who's also a civil engineer, and she's over there right now building Neom, which I never could have imagined. I'm very curious to see what it would come up with. So that's part of the Central Station universe. That's part of the continuity. And there's a few things that I've looked at. I became fascinated by the notion of Neanderthals who used to live in that geographical area where I grew up, basically. I could walk around the field and pick up Neanderthal tools, you know, that were just as sharp and possible to use today as they were 80, 100,000 years ago. And so that's something that recurs both in Golgotha, where we get that motif of the Neanderthals who were there before, but also in the science fiction world of Central Station, where I've written several stories where people bring Neanderthals back and we get Neanderthals living there again, and how the Neanderthals, in their way, have to now deal with a world that is complicated and they don't quite belong in, but they used to be there. And one of the things that I really touches me, I think I'll probably finish on that, is that we always used to think that when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals met, eventually the Homo sapiens hunted Neanderthals to extinction, and that's why they've disappeared. And we found out that that's not true. That they met, one of the places they met is in Israel, in the Carmel Mountain and around there, and they didn't fight each other. In fact, they lived together and they had children together. And I love that idea that there we go, we had two different species of humans, and eventually they lived together side by side in peace. So I'll finish on that note. If you have any questions, please ask me or comments.
Yes, thank you so much. That's very interesting. We're open to questions now.